our speakers today. This is a follow-up from the conference that Leslie and Adrian did about a month ago on PCORnet, and they focused on some details about the ADAPTABLE trial. But today we're actually going to do a deep dive into ADAPTABLE and focus on some of the operational innovations that are really making this a unique project at DCRI. And we want to have a robust discussion. So we'll have plenty of time for discussion, and we want active questions and a good interchange there. This is a unique study because it involves a lot of different groups of the DCRI who are collaborating actively, and some new groups as well. So the Mega Trials group, within HSR, a number of groups, the Center for Pragmatic Health Services Research led by Leslie, Center for Empirical Bioethics led by Laura Besco, who will be speaking today, Informatics and others, the Communication group led by Susan Landis, and many other teams working closely together to get this trial started. And it's really been fun, and we're trying to really actually do some novel things in this study, and we'll highlight that for you today. The approach of ADAPTABLE also is that we are charting a new path, and we're learning as we go. And so in some sense, today we'll tell you where we are at this point. We'll focus on the patient who's at the center of this research, some of the unique things about informed consent that we're doing with this study, and then Ty will highlight a lot of the unique operational approaches. So we'll have three speakers, and then we'll have a question and answer session. The first will be Skylar Jones, who's one of our faculty here, a cardiologist, who'll speak about patient engagement, and he's working with me and Adrian and Leslie and other faculty on this study. Second will be Laura Besco, who I mentioned earlier, who is really pioneered a very unique approach to informed consent for ADAPTABLE and done some really interesting comprehension testing and helping us with electronic informed consent, which we're kind of getting into really for the first time in a randomized trial at DCRI. And Ty Rorick, one of our associate directors of the Mega Trials group, will talk about a number of the operational innovations for the study and talk also about pragmatic budgeting, because that's really at the core of ADAPTABLE. So each speaker will go in turn, and then we'll have time for question and answers afterwards. Look forward to it, and I hope you enjoy the conference. So, Skylar.
All right, Matt, thank you. And I didn't have a lead-in slide, but really my topic today is patient engagement and how we're trying to actually get patients involved in ADAPTABLE. Obviously, this is a PCORI-funded study, and so it's part of the charter or underlying theme to really make sure that this is patient-centered. And having never, at least in my limited experience in trials, involved patients in the design and conduct of clinical studies, it's been really eye-opening to understand their perspective. So Matt and I have been on calls with our patient groups, and so I've learned a fair bit from them as how they see this study, or even the planning of the study, not to mention the actual conduct of the study. So as Matt said, we're really trying to involve patients in all aspects of ADAPTABLE, including getting them involved early in the protocol development, research prioritization. We have a group that's called the Adapters, which is specific to ADAPTABLE, as you can imagine. These are patient representatives or partners. They've looked at study materials. Laura's going to tell you about how they've participated in the informed consent process, but even as basic as patients seeing what they're presented before they sign on the informed consent line. So the patient video. Remember what Adrian, and I didn't get to come to Adrian and Leslie's presentation, but these patients are actually going to be directed to a website where they're going to sign up for this study. They're going to check boxes to say, are they candidates for the study? Do they meet inclusion-exclusion criteria? And then sign on the dotted line electronically, maybe without a research coordinator or a physician or clinician in the room. So we have to make sure that these patients understand that. So getting patients who have heart disease, who know how clinical trials work, and some of them do and some of them don't, but it's been pretty enlightening to learn from them. They're on our steering committee, and they're also on our data monitoring committee. So they're really involved in every aspect of this study. We have partners in California, the Healthy Heart Patient Powered Research Network, led by Madeline and Mark from UCSF, have really been instrumental in helping us engage these patients, the adapter groups, and really make sure that they gel with our steering committee, because they don't understand a lot of the language that we use on our steering committee calls when we talk about even what is a CDRN, a research network, or what is a randomized controlled trial. So I think that those are really important aspects of Adaptable that we're using or that we're engaging patients to be involved, having them look at patient-reported outcomes as they're being developed or being introduced, and Laura will talk about some of those. When we look at the actual adapters, so I told you that they're on the steering committee, they're on the DMC, they're part of each of the clinical data research networks for PCORNet, and so we're drawing them from each of the regions that the study is being conducted in. What's really interesting for them is they have little to no connection initially with the CDRN leadership. And so just connecting them with the CDRN leadership, some of them live in San Diego, but the CDRN leadership live in San Francisco. So some of that is just introductions and getting them on the same page. Most of these adapters have heart disease. Many of them do have clinical trial experience, but some of them have never heard of a clinical trial, never participated. And so trying to really get them engaged has been fun. And I think Matt, we have calls every 2 weeks with the adapters. Tomorrow's our next one. And so getting them on the same page has been a challenge, but something that's been really a fun and neat part of Adaptable. Like I said, speaking a common language, we think we speak a common language, but it's like speaking to your children or your parents about the medical terms and the clinical trials that we run. A lot of the time, they don't understand it, so we have to help them understand it and try not to use abbreviations. Talk about study process, the progress of the study. They're really interested and involved in when are we going to get a patient in the study? When's there going to be when are there going to be results from the study? I'm like, we all care about that. I'm like, let's get a patient in first. Actually, let's finalize the protocol, which got done last week, and then we'll get going on that. They're really interested in how will results be disseminated, so they're thinking, 2, 3, maybe 12 years down the road, how we'll do this. And so we've really been focusing on how to partner with them from a research and patient-specific standpoint. Getting them to understand each of the aspects has been a big challenge. And I can't say that we've done a perfect job. This is my first time doing it. So I think we may actually need a comprehension question about, are we doing a good job with our adapters in making sure that they understand their role in steering committee and DMC. But I do think that even on steering committee calls, we have patients who haven't participated, who are empowered to speak up and wanting to be engaged, and certainly join calls every week or every other week. So, all right. So that's my part for the patient engagement. I'll pass it to Laura now, who's going to talk about the consent process, which is really, like Matt said, a neat and novel way of doing this.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Beskow, and I'm here to tell you a little more about the work we've been doing on the consent process for Adaptable. As you've heard in other presentations as well as so far here today, Adaptable is really a unique study and kind of a real opportunity to be a national model for this sort of new research paradigm in terms of learning healthcare systems, pragmatic clinical trials, and so on. And so we think of the consent part in the same way as a real opportunity to try out new approaches and to try to be a model for how consent might be web-based, but participant-oriented and also effective in terms of helping people make good decisions about whether they want to take part or not. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the basic challenge we face is the same one we always have with consent forms, which is decades now of study after study documenting problems with consent forms being too long, that they are so long and seem to keep getting longer sometimes, so that patients don't even necessarily read the whole thing. Another related problem is the complexity that consent documents written at too high of a reading level, so that we would expect most people in the general population might not even be able to really understand what they're being asked to sign up for. So this is what we're up against, with these problems with length and complexity then leading to serious questions about comprehension, and whether in fact in some cases consent forms are actually becoming intimidating, and maybe even inhibiting rather than helping people understand, that people maybe are not even reading the whole thing, let alone comprehending what they're signing up for. So I'm sure you are, many of you are aware that new regulations have been proposed by the federal government in terms of human subjects protections. And if those are eventually made into regulation, then a lot of those are oriented around addressing this problem, that there would be regulations to make sure that consent forms are no longer these sort of unduly long documents where important information is kind of hidden in there somewhere. Instead, they would have to be very patient-oriented toward the things that a reasonable person would want to know, and formatted in a way that really highlights the key information. So that has kind of been our orientation on the Adaptable team. Thankfully, we bring a lot of resources to this one. I very much want to acknowledge my wonderful team who are sitting here today, who have been wonderful on this project. And also, we've done a fair amount of research now at Duke, specifically on simplifying informed consent and ways to improve comprehension. So we brought that to the process, but we still have this challenge of determining what would a person with heart disease want to know about the Adaptable study before they sign up. Our research, as well as some other studies, have shown, and I think Skylar maybe alluded to this too, that the way that participants think about these things and what they might identify as important may well be very different than what we as experts would identify. So the way we've approached this is, first of all, of course, we knew that we needed to meet regulatory requirements, so we drafted a form that we made sure met regulatory requirements. But beyond that, we were very focused on readability and length, keeping it simple, concise document. So this is to show that the very first draft that we wrote was 4 pages long. It was written at a 7th grade level. Over the intervening months, there's been a lot of input about information that maybe should be in there. We've been kind of the gatekeepers on that. But always when we add information, it's now 4.5 pages long, but still at a 7th grade level. So really trying to keep it simple for people to understand. The other part that we've then done in terms of the consent form is conduct a series of what are called cognitive interviews. For these, we enrolled patients with heart disease. Some of them were the adapters. We also had other patients with heart disease. We had them read the consent form, and then we went back to the top of the form, and for each main section of the form, we asked people to tell us in their own words what they understood it to be saying, asked if there was anything confusing, anything they especially liked or found concerning, and whether there was any extra information or details that they thought we could take out. Given the general tight time constraints of Adaptable in general, we weren't able to do a lot of interviews, but with 10 interviews, I think we actually had pretty good diversity in terms of people that we spoke with. And to give you a high-level summary of the results here, I think that we had a very high degree of both objective and subjective understanding. When we asked people to tell us in their own words what the form was saying, what they told us was in fact correct. They were getting it, and they reported not much confusion really at all, even about concepts like randomization. They really seemed to get it. They commented on appreciating the lack of legalese and the effort that we were making to include patient input on this. There was not much of anything they identified as extraneous that we could take out. There were some questions about those initial drafts in terms of some items that are listed here on the slide, and so then we set about making changes specifically to address those questions and concerns that people had. So this is sort of a paraphrase of a quote that one of the interviewees said during the conduct of these interviews that I think actually is a pretty good summary of the whole enchilada here. That this person saying that they thought this was a good job of describing the study using plain language. They felt it was organized well, easy to read, and music to our ears, saying this covers everything that they would think of as a patient. But then they went on to say that they'd participated in studies before and really had oftentimes found consent forms to be too technical, too hard to understand, and saying that when people don't understand, oftentimes they just go forward without asking questions. Or some people think that some of those details don't apply to them or find them actually overly scary. So I think that's actually a great summary of the whole thing that we're trying to address here. Now, the other part of this web-based process, again, as Skylar alluded to, this isn't going to be an in-person interaction between people, but a self-directed process for people when they go to the website. And so we wanted to make sure that we have a way to help people make sure they understand what they're signing up for. So coming up with some sort of a comprehension assessment is very much in keeping with FDA guidance from just this past year about electronic consent processes, where they recommend asking people some questions to assess their comprehension. We developed what has become a 6-item multiple choice quiz, and the bottom line of how we approach this is the concept of the difference between ideal and essential understanding. That ideally we might like everyone to understand everything in the consent form, but in reality it's only a subset, and in fact a pretty small subset of the stuff in a consent form that is so crucial that if the person doesn't understand it, that we would actually question the validity of their consent. And so that was our approach to coming up with these quiz questions, and then using technical guidance about how do you come up with good multiple choice answers and things like that. So again, we conducted cognitive interviews specifically on the quiz. We had people read the consent form, take the quiz. While they're taking the quiz, speak aloud about how they're evaluating the answer options and how they arrived at their final answer. Again, we had interviewed 14 people, many of the adapters as well as others, with a pretty good range of demographic characteristics. And in general, I would say people liked the quiz. They found it helpful. They didn't find it too onerous. They felt like it covered the right information and so on. So the way that this will be implemented online is there's a video for the consent process, then they'll see the written consent material, and then there's this quiz, but it will be framed as, we want to make sure that we have done a good job explaining this to you. So then there'll be the 6 questions, and we're really using this as a chance to reinforce key concepts. So when people answer each question, then they'll be told specifically if they answered correctly or incorrectly, but also be given an additional bit of information to explain why the correct answer was correct and why the incorrect answers were incorrect. So this is an example up here of one of the quiz questions, asking about how you're going to be assigned your aspirin dose that your doctor's going to choose, you'll choose, or the computer will choose. So let's say I answered correctly, the computer was going to choose, then this web-based process would come up and say correct, and then explain neither you nor your doctor is going to choose the dose of aspirin, rather the computer will assign it, and it's important that you take the dose that you were assigned. So again, a chance to reinforce sort of key information. So I will stop there. We look forward to sharing with you how all this goes when actually implemented.
Okay. Thanks, Laura.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ty Rorick. I'm one of the associate directors in our mega trials group, working with Laura, Skylar, Matt, Adrian, Lisa Berdan, Leslie, lots of people on the ADAPTABLE trial. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about some of the operational questions about just in general electronic patient outreach and how we might be able to accomplish this. And then I'll summarize at the end some budget differences. So I think Matt called it pragmatic budgeting, which we may need to develop a group on pragmatic budgeting, because I can tell you it's been one of the most difficult parts of trying to figure out how we do a 20,000 patient study for around, I'll give away the end now, but for around $10 million. And I'll show you some comparisons to a more traditional clinical trial in some of the areas where you'll see in my next few slides, some of the areas where we have to think really hard about how we accomplish this type of work. Just to sort of set the stage a bit, and I know the first couple are a little bit difficult to see, but who are our important stakeholders? So certainly patients are the most important stakeholder in this trial, but when you get to some of the logistics of how we're going to accomplish this, PCORI, which I know many of you have heard about and we've talked a lot about, was authorized by Congress in 2010. ADAPTABLE is funded by PCORI, and Adrian certainly, as well as Leslie and others, are very involved in all aspects of PCORI and PCORNet. The CDRNs and PPRNs, and we've talked some of that previously at other research conferences, but there are 13 clinical data research networks that are part of PCORNet. There were 2 that were just recently added at the University of Florida and Mayo Clinic. Of those 13, we asked who was interested initially, and we had anywhere from 7 to 8 or so that were interested in participating in ADAPTABLE. We are currently funded for 5, looking for additional funds to try to get others on board, but we're currently funded for 5 CDRNs to participate. And the CDRNs are really the ones that have to drive home what we're trying to accomplish here, because they're the ones that have to do local patient and physician engagement. They have to identify the patients using a computable phenotype that they'll run against their electronic health record and data mart, and they're responsible for recruitment and ultimately ensuring that the trial gets done. Skylar mentioned one of the PPRNs we're working with, which is Healthy Heart. There are 22 in total PPRNs that are part of PCORNet. And as Skylar mentioned, Healthy Heart's primary role is patient engagement through the adapter process. We have a trial portal that will be managed by Mitris. And I don't know how many people have heard of Mitris, but Mitris is their core work is really e-consent. That's where they started. They're a company based in Davis, California. I think we've worked really closely with Mitris since they came on board a few months ago about how we will implement this type of trial. And I'd say, currently have a really good and strong partnership with them. They're our technical partner for ADAPTABLE. They will be responsible for the e-consent, setting up the e-consent, patient-reported outcomes, the case report forms, and all of the reporting aspects of ADAPTABLE. There will also be a public and a public and a patient access through the portal. We want to, everything that we do on ADAPTABLE is public. The protocol was just published public on PCORNet in the last week. So everything we do, we want to always ensure that we have public access that they can look. Patients obviously need a different kind of access to the trial because they'll have to randomize themselves, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then all of the randomizations will occur through the portal. And then us here at DCRI, we're the coordinating center for ADAPTABLE, so faculty, ops, HSR call center, some of our data team are involved, stats, communications, and ultimately we have oversight and responsibility for the trial, for all of the study partners, and the call center as well. So I've sort of summarized the next few slides in a series of what I'd say are operational questions, sort of how are we going to do these things. So the first one is, can a group of 5 networks, which represent about 20 to 25 what we would call traditional sites, enroll 20,000 patients over a 24-month period, and what tools and methods will they need to employ to be successful with that? And I'll go through each one of these in the next few slides. Are patients willing to participate in a study without seeing or talking to their physician? Skylar mentioned this, and I think Laura mentioned this in her presentation as well. If you just got a random email from Duke Health saying, hey, we've got this trial for you, click this link and go for it, would you do that without talking to anybody? And that's sort of what we're asking patients to do here. Does the frequency of patient follow-up matter in terms of adherence and retention? I'll talk a little bit about that, because not only will patients be randomized to a dose of aspirin, they'll also be randomized to a frequency of follow-up, and that will allow us the opportunity to see if there are any differences there. Would you be willing to provide your last 4 digits of your Social Security number in a case report form to people you don't really know? Again, you just got this link and you're being asked to do this, and now on a subsequent visit, and I'll talk a little bit about why we did that, we're asking you now to give us the last 4 digits of your Social Security number, and we want to know who your health insurer is. And how would you consider managing collection of select concomitant meds directly from the patient? I think one of the things we've heard from the adapters and many folks in general is, as we know, these are relatively sick patients. They come in with generally a bag of meds. We're only asking for a couple, which is pragmatic and streamlined, but they're still going to have to pretty much look at every bottle they have to figure out to answer the questions that we're asking them. So how would, one of the things we need to think really hard about are how do we manage that? So the first question is, can we do this? I mentioned that a site and Adaptable is a health system within the CDRN. Local clinical and patient engagement is probably the most important thing that the CDRN will be responsible for. That's making sure that physicians in their health systems are aware. They're doing that through meetings, calls, materials that both we'll be providing through our communications group, as well as materials that the local CDRN will be responsible to pull together. It is patient-powered. So Skylar mentioned that all of the CDRNs have a patient rep. We want the CDRN to tap into that patient rep so that the patients are part of the process, part of the materials, understand what we're asking the local clinicians to do. And then we've sort of left it up to the CDRNs to strategize how best to do this locally within their network. Nobody knows their network better than they do. So some of them are doing different things. So one of those, Mid-South, which is one of the CDRNs, which is Vanderbilt, they've conducted a survey across their patients already to look at who might be interested in a trial like this, to sort of already obtain some information on those types of what might be the uptake. Patient outreach. So how will patients actually find out about Adaptable? They'll find out through either direct mail or an email message. That will be locally customized by the CDRN. They may find out by clinic, by coming into the clinic. PATH, which is Penn State, Pitt, Northeast Temple, one of the CDRNs, they actually are putting a tickler in their Epic system that if a patient shows up with the criteria that we've outlined that says, hey, this patient might be eligible for Adaptable, you can talk to them about it. And then there are certain LA CDRN, which is Ochsner, Tulane down in Louisiana. They have some iPad technology that they've created across their CDRN to identify patients. So we've sort of left it to each CDRN to do their own thing as it relates to outreach. We also want the CDRNs to share across each other. That's one of the most important, again, aspects of Adaptable and the network, is that we don't want CDRNs doing things in isolation. We want, one of the goals is for them to share information, and that's one of the things that we'll make sure happens here at the Coordinating Center. And then approach versus randomization rate. So we will have tools and measures available to all the CDRNs to see how many patients they approached, what was the uptake, who went to the website or the portal but didn't sign in, who went to the website and went so far but then stopped. We'll be able to tell all of those kind of analytic tools so that we can feed that information back to the CDRNs and they can make adjustments to their plans and recruitment plans as they move forward. Are patients willing to participate in a study without seeing or talking to the MD? We've talked about the patient perspective. We've tried and we continue to strive really hard to make sure that the content that goes on the portal is patient-friendly, and we will be sharing that content with the adapters. We want to make sure it's easy so that access, passwords, functionality, all things that somebody can easily do without much trouble. I think one of our biggest worries that this will be too complicated, that they'll be, hey, I want to do this and I got the letter, but when I go to sign up, it's just too complicated and they just give up. That's one of the things we're going to work really carefully to be sure that doesn't happen. The time commitment, we also want to make sure we don't ask tons of questions at every time we get a contact with them, because we want the time spent with them to be short, to get what we need, and allow the patient to just go on with their day. One of the nice aspects of something we struggled with early, but Mitris allows us the ability to do, is have both English and Spanish, so the patient will be able to select which language they prefer. Local MD and patient engagement, I've talked about. Skylar touched on the steering committee and the reps there. I've talked about recruitment letters. The CDRNs will get feedback reports. one of the real important questions that we'll actually ask patients before they get randomized is, are they willing to change their aspirin dose if they happen to get randomized to something different? If they say, I'm not willing to, then obviously we're not going to include that patient in the study. And that was something we added recently as just a safeguard to be sure we don't end up with people in the trial that then drop right afterwards. What does it mean as it relates to frequency of follow-up? So as I mentioned, patients will be randomized to 2 different follow-up frequencies. One is every 3 months and one is every 6 months. The DCRI call center will intervene if the patient misses 2 consecutive follow-ups, utilizing the contact information that we'll collect at patient randomization. The trial is not supplying aspirin, so for those that have to change their aspirin dose, they're going to have to, once they get randomized and find out what that dose is, they're going to have to go to their local pharmacy, get the aspirin that's required to take, and start taking it. Patients are being compensated, but it's $25 one time, and it's at basically the start of the trial, not at baseline. We want to be sure they come back at least once. So at the week 2 visit, which is just a check-in on the follow-up on the computer, as long as they complete that, they'll get their $25 card for participating. And that, my last point there about 2-week post-randomized follow-up, that's really just to confirm that did they change their dose? What dose of aspirin are they on? And we moved some of the base data that we were initially going to collect at baseline. We moved some of that to that week 2 visit, again, to reduce the burden on the patient so they don't feel like overwhelmed at that baseline visit because there's a lot they already have to do. The bit about Social Security numbers. So at the 2-week visit, we will ask the patient to provide the last 4 digits of their Social Security number, which is covered in the consent form, and we'll ask them to provide whether they're on Medicare or not and their insurance coverage. These won't be required fields. We hope everybody gives us this because we need it for other attributes as we do some follow-up. Because that's the primary reason we're asking this. It's to be utilized for patient follow-up via either CMS or claims data. And the possibility to use this information to collect and look at out-of-network events. And out-of-network events are events that a patient has that they go to a hospital that they're not part of that CDRN. So if Duke was part of a CDRN, but I went to the dreaded UNC for healthcare, we'd want to be sure to capture that data. And the only way we could do that now is if the patient reported it and we were able to follow up through that through another mechanism, because Duke isn't part of that CDRN and we wouldn't, or UNC wouldn't be part of that CDRN and we wouldn't have access to that through their EHR. How would you consider managing the con meds? So again, only select con meds will be collected. We're only collecting them annually. We're collecting antiplatelets, NSAIDs, and GI meds, and those are limited to PPIs and H2 blockers. Patients likely will need to go through all of their meds, as I mentioned earlier, to answer 4 easy questions from our perspective, and that gets to how we see things versus how a patient sees things. Other data that we will collect we will collect patient-reported outcomes every 6 and 12 months, con meds annually, their aspirin dose. Every time we connect with them, we want to know what dose of aspirin are and if they've changed it or they've stopped taking it, why. And then hospitalizations will be collected at every visit. This just sort of is a busy but summary of sort of the whole centralized enrollment and follow-up. So from the patient portal to what the call center will do, to how the patients are identified at the CDRN level and where the baseline data comes from, which is from the CDRN, the follow-up, and I've highlighted the difference in randomization for 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 out to several years, and then how the data will come in, which that's something that Leslie and her group gave a lot of good detail on a few weeks ago. So I'll move right into pragmatic budgeting. So how do we do all of what I just described at 20,000 for 20,000 patients for around $10 million? First of all, the protocol and consent template are now final, and that's the website. If you go out to that website, pecornet.org, and look at and search aspirin, you'll find the final versions are out there and posted. The budget is set at $10 million. It's actually a little over $10 million. It's like $10.5. A typical trial this size, and I'll show you on the next slide, would run anywhere from about $250 million up. And that wouldn't cover all the costs associated with a big trial. There are other costs that would be included in there as well that aren't reflected in that $250. The per patient grant for this trial is $210 per patient. And it's not really completed patients, it's randomized patient. In a typical trial, a big phase 3, phase 4 trial, you're looking at probably $10,000 to $20,000 per completed patient. Obviously, the site has to do a lot more work in that trial than in this trial. And one of the things we really want to work hard with our sites in Adaptable is we don't want them to fall back into the traditional model because they'll lose their shirts. That's one thing. And it won't help us really test the methodology that we're trying to test in Adaptable, is whether this network can actually recruit patients in this way. And then patient compensation, I said it's great that we're giving $25 for a patient to participate, but in a typical big trial, they get $25 to $100 for every on-site visit. So not just once for the duration of the trial. And we actually got some feedback from some of the adapters that the $25 is sort of like almost a slap in the face. Like, really? Like, you're only gonna give me $25? So we probably, most likely, we will give them an option to, if they wanna donate it, they could, so that we want them to have, in all that we're doing, I think we want patients to have options as it relates to what their conduct of the trial. And then here, this is a recent big diabetes trial that we did that started in 2008. And the rough budget was around $250 million at the end of the day. And this is Adaptable, which you can see is around $10.4 million at the end of the day. And you can see a few differences sort of just in the percent of the overall budget. I'd say site patient IRB payments are relatively similar. And data's more in this than it would be in a traditional model, and that mostly is reflective of the work around the common data model, because every piece of data we're getting here is electronic. We're not getting information directly from patients because they're not coming in for visits. We're either getting it through the database or through the CDM. So those are some of, I'd say, the key differences, but if you looked at this closely, there are several areas that are pretty similar from a percent point of view. But we've had to work and think really hard, and we've had to cut things that were originally in to get to the mandated final budget, which couldn't be more than 10.5. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and ask a question, sure. That's the last. Let me just finish up real quick. This just summarizes the sort of how we got to the 10 million. So the traditional versus Adaptable. And I won't go through all of these in detail, but you can just see that a lot of it, and I think everybody in this room knows how traditional trials are done. And Adaptable, it's more, everything's based on patient-directed, based on what's in the data, the CDM, patient-reported. So you can see when you look through here, it's like patient, from the CDM. It's not direct patient to site contact in most cases. But I saw a hand go up real quick.
Why don't we have Skylar and Laura come up, and I know we'll have a lot of questions. Thanks, Skylar, Laura, and Ty, for your presentations. I think we have about 20 minutes, so hopefully we'll be able to have a robust question and answer session. And I don't think, actually, they don't need a microphone, I think. They say that they're in the ceiling, so you guys can pass that. It's watching you everywhere. So where was the first question?
Just wondering, when you show the budgets, you use the same rates?
So you use the same rates in the budget? No.
Sure you do. Faculty are at a discount.
Yeah.
It's not the only.
So Laura, I'll ask you a question. Some have said, why do we even need informed consent for this trial where it's an over-the-counter therapy that anyone could go purchase from the pharmacy on their own and take it without a physician prescription? That's come up a number of times in our debates about the informed consent process. So maybe you could weigh in on that a little bit, because that's somewhat unique for this trial rather than using an experimental therapy.
I think that, do I need
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think that that's a great question, and I think it's one that needs to be kind of in the forefront when you talk about pragmatic trials, about what is the proper role of informed consent. And I think that the fact that people take aspirin every day by themselves, with or without their physician, and so on, really ways toward keeping the consent simple and not, this complex process. But in this case, the idea that many of these people either take a particular dose now based on their doctor's prescription, and they might be asked to change, or perhaps they don't take aspirin at all, and that they would start specifically for this study, I think is a reason to at least tell them and give them have them make an informed choice about whether they want to be involved. The other thing that will be different in this study from just people's usual clinical care is the fact that researchers will be collecting data on them, and it'll be banked and used for an unlimited amount of time. I think that's another reason to let people know that it's going to happen and give them a choice. But again, keeping it simple and so they understand and decide what they want to do.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about having a pragmatic trial that we didn't go through but should be recognized, and that is that when you're testing an experimental therapy, the site has to store the drug and account for the drug, and that's all part of the regulatory process. That's not part of a pragmatic trial. Obviously, those are huge costs and something that we couldn't do in a pragmatic fashion. So we had to do a trial where the drug was accessible over the counter and didn't have to be stored and administered by the site personnel. I think that was key.
So I'll first comment, and it goes to sort of this broad swath of people in front of you. This truly isn't a trial; it's a showcase. It really is, and we should be remarkably proud, somewhat a little frightened, but all of us in this room ought to be paying remarkable attention to this, because you're seeing every one of the things of a lot of work on a lot of people's parts to build up, now culminating and being thrust into one study. I mean, all the work that Laura's doing on informed consent and where that's going, all the work that Adrian and Leslie and others are doing with regards to how can we use EHRs and claims-based thing to do both enrollment as well as potentially follow-up. The work the trials group has done about figuring out where costs can be cut all through this thing, monitoring, etc. It's remarkable. So that's the first thing. You guys fully both need to be congratulated and amazed that we're rolling this all out in one. The other thing is, while this doesn't say that every study could be done for 10 million as we move forward, thankfully, the director is out of a job very quickly. But there are pieces and parts of this that, if they pan out to be successful, will be remarkably important into how we can enroll parts of this, at least, and progressively hopefully more and more parts of this into all the trials that we do and all the registries we do. So no matter what, in part, we'll learn a lot, and this will change the way things are done. And I think it's incredible. So first off there.
Thank you.
But now first of the tougher parts. The one is on the, and not to say you haven't built everything into this, but the adapters part is pretty unique in this thing. And you're already doing some randomization to how quickly you have to do follow-up. Is there more of a role that the adapters could play, even you have them on the front end some in enrollment? I didn't hear quite, are they as much enrolled on the back end in terms of keeping their colleagues engaged? Is there a group or shared mentality thing that could be worked here to try to get people to remain in the study for years? And if there is that plan, should that actually be randomized as well?
And that's a great suggestion. We really haven't gotten to that point yet because we're so focused right now on startup and recruitment, but we definitely need to keep that as one of our key action items. Now, we've never had a group like the adapters before, and so the retention and follow-up part will be critical. And so we can certainly build in randomization to that as the trial moves on and starts to progress. The question will be really is how do we connect the adapter people? Right now we're having trouble just connecting them with CDER personnel, let alone with the patients in the trial. Yeah.
Chat room or other kind of site where a portion of the patients who are enrolled could actually interchange with each other and potentially with the adapters to try to, or could the adapters send, routine letters? This is incredible. Thank you very much for your help. Here's what I'm going through. Talk to me, kind of thing.
We're hoping not to use snail mail.
Well, I think that's a great suggestion. We definitely need to keep that in one of our work streams and sort that out because we really haven't had much talk about retention or loss of follow-up yet because we're so focused on can we recruit the patients and get them to enroll, but that needs to be a clear aspect of what we're focusing on for this trial.
This is totally unfair, but I'll go ahead. I guess one of the things I'd like to hear from some of you guys, and maybe each can comment, what's been the biggest surprise or challenge, and from kind of each of the roles that you've done and taken on, Laura in terms of the IRB and consent, Skylar with some of the engagements. You highlight some of these things, Ty, but what were the biggest surprises from each of you?
Why don't we start with Skylar and we'll move down and say, what you get one big surprise.
The biggest surprise is that we think we can do this with first patient in December. That's number one.
We keep saying no.
I think we can. From a patient. It was an unfair question, Adrian. From a patient engagement, I think it's getting patients to a website with a number that allows them to get into the study without any engagement with a coordinator or physician clinician. Just thinking about how I enroll patients in the cath lab or in the clinic, it's a huge surprise to me to say we can actually randomly allocate or assign a patient. Granted, it's a dose of aspirin, but we can do this while they're at home on the iPad. Be a big surprise, but I think we can do it. We will do it.
Okay.
I'm predicting January, but that's a different story.
Okay. Laura, let's hear it.
I'll say two things. One, I would say the most gratifying thing, I think, is the chance for us, our empirical bioethics group, to be integrated in real time with the trial. So we do a lot of studies, a lot of work on consent, and so the chance not only to put it to work, but to be in real time working on the development of the trial with these materials, and the reception, I think, of everybody that's been involved in terms of really being interested in here's what patients say, and it's been a really great experience for us. I think what won't necessarily be surprising, but I think it's going to be the biggest challenge with this whole approach to consent is what the IRBs are going to say at the various CDRN sites. We've had various calls with the sites and tried to explain it and provided a lot of documentation about how these materials meet regulatory requirements, but I think it's understandably difficult for maybe IRBs and researchers in some cases to really let go of the template language that they're used to seeing and look at this simpler approach and see that maybe this really is what patients have said that is important and is a simple way to explain it. So I think that's our biggest challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, aside from those things, which have been both challenging and I think we'll learn a lot, especially on the IRB front. We don't really know what that'll look like yet. As Laura said, we've had a lot of discussion about that. I'd say the biggest surprise for me is in working with the CDRNs, I think it continues to be a little bit of a struggle. There are big groups that cover pretty vast networks of health systems. And so you may talk to one person, but how that information then gets disseminated out, I think we found that it doesn't generally. So we have to say and talk and meet and sort of say the same thing over and over again. Probably more than the usual 3 times you say it for someone to learn it. I think it's probably more like 15 here. And I think that's just because of the size and scope, and that many of the folks that we interact with every day have never done this before, the trial work. I mean, they do lots and lots of important stuff, but they haven't necessarily done a big trial. So getting all of those people sort of on board has been a challenge, and I think will continue to be a bit of a challenge as we move forward.
And I'll add to that, I have a mic here, so I'll add to that, and I'm sure Leslie and Adrian will echo these comments. The biggest surprise for me has been working with the sponsor, which is PCORI, because I'm very familiar with working with industry sponsors and other sponsors who really have experience in conducting trials, and in essence, they don't have that experience. And so our whole approach to sponsor management has been vastly different, and that's been a surprise. It's been a good learning experience. I haven't had to deal with certainly the number of headaches that Leslie and Adrian and others have had to deal with, but that's a challenge for us, and that's something that we're having to adapt to, which is a bad pun, but for this trial, because the approach of we're actually having to almost train many at PCORI whom we're interacting with about how to do trials, and in that way, it's been a little bit of a challenge, and we're still working on that. But again, we're learning, and as Eric said, we're all learning lessons, and the reason why we're doing these research conferences, and we will continue to do that through the life of the trial, is so we can share our learnings with you and with others, and everything is public, right? So we're sharing what we're doing publicly, and we're collaborating actively, which is at the core of our whole mission at the DCRI, and I think that's important. But I think there are challenges. We never anticipated these, but I think we have the right team to meet them. John had.
Laura, you touched on this a little bit from the standpoint of IRBs, but I'm also interested from all of you about the perspective of practicing physicians at the CDRNs or at the sites, investigators, coordinators who in some ways are being, as you're getting participants more involved, you're getting them less involved in their traditional roles in these trials.
You're still in the money.
Yeah. Well,
The money they lose.
last week we had, or maybe 2 weeks ago, we had a call with CDRNs, and we had a very involved senior guy who said, "I'm going to enroll in clinic with my coordinator." And like Ty said, that was the third or fourth time we had said, "You can't. This is really designed not to do that." And so, John, I think it just highlights the fact that everyone, until we get the ball really rolling and the rubber hits the road, we're going to have to continue to repeat these things.
Beth, you had a question?
Yeah, it was more a comment. I mean, hearing this, it's really exciting and fun. And then also hearing Evan Myers do uterine fibroid. The two groups are similar. They're going to enroll 10,000 patients. They have a patient portal. They have, I think, 9 clinical sites in the U.S. sending those patients there as a registry for uterine fibroid. So it'd be nice to connect the two groups to start. I think in the next few months they should hopefully have a patient. And so your timelines are really close, and they have their patient group together. And Susan Landis has been working a lot with that group because they're creating a community and trying to get things all put together. So it'd be good to put the groups together.
Thank you, that's a great
Make them
suggestion.
both better.
Certainly. Jerry?
Yeah, 2 unrelated questions. So, there's a lot of vigilance around, investigators around relationships with industry and trials of this sort. Do the adapters have to go through that similar process in terms of their potential relationship with industry and stock ownership and that sort of thing?
Let me answer that first question just while we're on it, if you could. It really hasn't come up because, in essence, we're working with PCORI. The adapters, we'll have a contract with them, but all of them are just patient representatives, and I think for the most part haven't had any relationships, and that hasn't really come up with the physician leadership in some sense because it's not as directly pertinent to adaptable, but maybe you could clarify your question a little bit more about what you're interested in that line of reasoning.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an intriguing approach, and as you think sort of outside of PCORI, if you're going to, apply this in other settings, I mean, that might be something to consider when there may be some more attention to relations with industry.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, everything's public here. Everything's disclosed about this trial and what we're doing. We actually put the protocol out for public review and comment for a month in July, and we had a series of targeted questions that we used to help modify the protocol. We've never done that before. We're here at the DCRI transparent, and we all share our conflicts on our website. So I think that's the approach that we're trying to do for everything about this study going forward, and I think that's our best foundation, certainly.
The second question, unrelated. Have you had any conversations with your colleagues who do research maybe outside of the U.S.? Because I'm interested in this approach to informed consent using, mobile applications or iPads and all that stuff. Obviously, I do a lot of international stuff, but I'm wondering, do your international colleagues, do they see this as something applicable to other parts of the world?
Well, the most discussion we've had was with our friends in Sweden, in Uppsala, Stefan James and others who've conducted and are conducting numerous registry-based trials in Sweden. They've kind of set the standard, but they embed that within the care process so that the patients say they're getting a procedure, a coronary intervention, they're getting a consent for the procedure, and they'd also consent at the same time for that, or they're getting treated for an acute MI and they're getting consented, just for that treatment initially, and they'll embed that within the care process. But they're not doing direct-to-patient outreach yet in terms of how they include patients in the trial or even how they do follow-up, because they're just actually getting the data from their electronic national health record and not actually building portals to get information directly from the patients. But we're learning a lot from them, and we're sharing those. Other countries, are doing a lot of observational research with national health records. We've had numerous colleagues from Denmark and some who've trained here who are doing a great job with that, but they're not doing randomization and embedding, those randomized questions. But we are actively trying to collaborate with anyone around the world who's willing, ready, or able to do this. But for the most part, it's been, except for in Sweden, it's been mostly observational research.
Hey, Matt, we have certain attributes of what we're doing here. We're in the process of getting set up right now on a big diabetes trial called Harmony Outcomes. More, I'd say, and Leslie, would you agree, on the back end, probably more than on the front end, where we're not doing e-consent or any of those types of activities. But we are looking at, can we get data from their EHR and compare it to what the site puts in the case report form to see if, could you do it? Could you kind of take that next jump, which adaptable is the next jump, something where you're going fully into it. But that sub-study is international. I mean, there's several countries that will be taking part in it.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest challenges in multiple countries, which they're facing in this, is, can you share national health record data from multiple countries in some way? Right. Here, it's just in the U.S. It's within a structure that's already been built. And what Ty didn't talk about was the infrastructure cost that went into building PCORnet, which is far more than $10 million. And if we didn't have the common data model and PCORnet as an infrastructure, we could never do adaptable. And that's only in the US, but we had agreement, there was initiative to do that. But when you're talking about sharing data from other countries, then it gets to be more complicated. And those, so we're trying to do multiple parallel paths along this road of pragmatic research, both observational and randomized trials, both in the US and in other countries. And we just have to make incremental steps and learn as we go and share that with our community. And then the next study that we are planning, try to add those things on and try to innovate further.
I was just going to say, as far as the consent part, I think that technology like iPads and whatnot, I think on the one hand, they hold a lot of promise in terms of helping people understand studies, because we can have like a video like what we have for Adaptable, or use graphics, or just various ways that kind of technology might help people in a lot of different settings. I think in terms of the collecting data from people, like from mobile devices and different things like that, I think that it depends on which country we're talking about. I mean, we're doing a study now in the US at some sites where that sort of technology would be pretty foreign to some people in terms of their access to it or their comfort with using it. So it's interesting to think about how those kinds of things could be used in settings where maybe those technologies are not as common for people to have access to.
Why don't we do maybe one more question from Jerry and then wrapping up as the hour is getting.
Matt, I was just wondering, just even looking on the patient level, are you going to more or less ask these people to not participate in other studies, or are you going to keep them, because again, with the mega trials, you always hear competition for patients, and the infrastructure focusing on certain trials because they get more. I mean, just from the patient level, I'm going to get $25 once or $100 a visit over here. And how are you going to, what's the impetus to keep these people, in and focus, and even in the infrastructure? If I'm getting $210 per patient or 19,000.
So,
well, yeah, I mean,
we certainly can't pay them more, Jerry. But, I think we're going to, in our traditional trials, we get helpline calls about this a fair bit, and we often will say we want them to continue participating in the trial that they signed up for, and hopefully we maintain that. But that's step 2. We haven't gotten there.
Yeah, we haven't gotten there, but we're not going to limit people from doing other studies, and we're a pragmatic trial. The question about competition for the patients in the site certainly is germane, and those parts we haven't really sorted out yet. But the key here is that we're trying to embed this in usual care and practice, and if the patients are approached during their follow-up and adaptable for another experimental trial, we're not going to limit that. We probably won't even be collecting that information, really, for that matter, but I think it'll all balance out with large sample size and randomization.
And I was just going to add, don't put too much emphasis on the $210 per patient. And that's mostly because if it works like it should work, the local site really doesn't have to do much of anything. I mean, because the computable phenotype will tell them which patients to approach. It'll all go out electronically, they'll consent, they don't have, I mean, conceivably,
Yeah.
they're going, the magic wand is that they shouldn't have to do very much, which is why we feel like we can justify as best we can that that's what it is here. And Matt mentioned it, I think, but the dollars that have went into each CDRN to build the infrastructure to get us to this place aren't insignificant.
Yeah.
Nor are the dollars that have went into the CDRNs in phase 2 to keep it up and running.
Yeah.
So there are multiple funding mechanisms for each of the CDRNs aside from this one.
So as we wrap up, I'll say our study team is fully committed to sharing all the information about Adaptable. Susan and the communications team is our key partner in that. We will do ongoing updates with research conferences and as we learn, and we'll share that with everyone here at the DCRI and with the general research community. And I think as we go, we will adapt as we go, I think certainly. But we appreciate your attention and the great discussion today. Thank you for coming.